For the time being, it's impossible for me to take my family back to the UK safely. Well, for a start, the only time that I've come back to the UK is...
At first, it sounded like another familiar chapter in the long and painful story between Prince William, the Prince of Wales, and Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex. Another report, another claim, another suggestion that reconciliation might still be possible. But this time, one detail changed the mood completely. If the latest palace discussion is being understood correctly, this was not simply about whether two brothers could speak again. It was about whether the future king was prepared to risk the monarchy for one more emotional attempt at peace. 4 years, the story of William and Harry has been told as a family disagreement, a painful royal split between two brothers who once seemed inseparable. But inside the British royal family, that fracture has come to represent something much larger. It is no longer only about hurt feelings, interviews, memoirs, public accusations, or who said what behind palace walls. It has become a test of trust, reputation, duty, and the future shape of the monarchy itself. And that is why this latest reported development matters. According to royal commentators and ongoing public discussion, Prince Harry may still hope for some form of private reconciliation with King Charles III and senior members of the family. But what has made this story so sensitive is the suggestion that Prince William is no longer willing to treat reconciliation as a simple family matter. To the Prince of Wales, it may now be seen as an institutional risk. And once a family wound becomes a risk to the crown, everything changes. Because in royal life, forgiveness is never only private. One meeting can become a headline. One photograph can become a signal. One carefully worded statement can be interpreted as a full royal reset, even when the people involved are nowhere near ready to trust one another again. And for William, who stands not only as Harry's brother but as the future king, that distinction may be the most important part of the entire story. Was this really about refusing Harry personally? Or was it about preventing the monarchy from being pulled once again into a cycle of hope, pressure, disappointment, and public drama? That question sits at the heart of this opening chapter. Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, remains one of the most complicated figures in the modern royal story. To some viewers, he is a wounded son who stepped away from the institution and still carries the emotional weight of that decision. To others, he is a royal figure who damaged trust through interviews, public criticism, and repeated revelations about private family matters. Both views exist at the same time, and that is exactly why the subject remains so powerful. Harry's story is not easy to reduce to one simple sentence. But Prince William's position is equally complex. The Prince of Wales is no longer seen only as the older brother who was hurt by Harry's choices. He is increasingly viewed as the man preparing to inherit the monarchy at one of its most fragile modern moments. King Charles III is still the monarch, but William represents the next chapter. He carries the image of continuity, stability, and discipline. Every decision around him now feels larger than the family itself, because one day, the public will judge not only his emotions, but his leadership. And that is where the tension becomes deeper. If reports about Harry seeking some form of renewed contact are accurate, then William's response cannot be understood only as personal coldness. It may also reflect a much harder calculation. Can the royal household afford another attempted reconciliation that later collapses in public? Can Buckingham Palace or Kensington Palace risk another moment where private family pain becomes international commentary? And can Catherine, Princess of Wales, be pulled once more into a story that she did not create but may be expected to symbolically repair? That last point is especially important. Catherine has often been placed by the public and the media into the role of the quiet bridge, the dignified figure who might soften tensions simply by appearing calm beside others. But that image, while powerful, also carries pressure. If Catherine appears near Harry, people may call it forgiveness. If she does not, people may call it distance. If she remains silent, the silence is interpreted. If she speaks, the words are dissected. In that sense, her presence becomes more than personal. It becomes a royal symbol. And William understands symbols. The monarchy survives through symbols as much as statements. A balcony appearance, a shared church walk, a joint photograph, a carefully placed seat at a royal event. These things can say more than official language ever could. That is why reconciliation inside the royal family cannot be treated like an ordinary private conversation. Once the public sees a sign, the public begins to build a story around it. But what if the trust behind the sign has not returned? That may be the fear guiding William's reported firmness. Not anger alone, not pride alone, but the belief that the monarchy cannot keep offering symbolic gestures unless the foundation underneath them is real. Because if a royal gesture promises healing before healing has happened, the damage later becomes even worse. For King Charles III, the situation is more painful still. As a father, the king may naturally feel the pull of his younger son. As monarch, however, he must protect the institution he spent a lifetime preparing to lead. That is the tragedy of royal duty. The crown does not remove family pain. It simply forces that pain to be weighed against history, public trust, and the long-term survival of the institution. And this is why William's role feels so significant. If the Prince of Wales has indeed taken a firmer position against reopening the reconciliation process, then it suggests a silent shift in royal power. Not a rebellion against King Charles, not an open challenge, but a recognition that William is now the person who must live with the future consequences. He is the one who will inherit the public mood, the family fractures, the institutional wounds, and the responsibility of making the monarchy feel steady after years of turbulence. So perhaps the real story is not simply that Harry made a plea or that William rejected it. Perhaps the real story is that the royal family may be moving from emotional uncertainty into a new phase of controlled distance. A phase where sympathy still exists, but access is no longer automatic. Where love may remain complicated, but trust has become the deciding issue. Where brotherhood is remembered, but the monarchy comes first. And that leaves one uncomfortable question hanging over everything. If reconciliation is no longer being guided by hope, but by risk, then what does Prince Harry actually have left to return to? Because what begins as a family disagreement can, over time, become something much harder to undo. It can become policy. It can become precedent. It can become the quiet understanding that some doors are not slammed shut in anger, but locked slowly in the name of protection. And to understand why this reported refusal feels so important, we have to look beyond the latest headline and into the deeper wound that has been building for years. The wound that may explain why Prince William now appears determined not simply to answer Harry's plea, but to draw a line the monarchy will not cross again. And once that line begins to form, the story becomes less about one emotional request and more about the kind of monarchy Prince William appears to be preparing to lead. Because in every royal generation, there comes a moment when the institution quietly decides what it can survive and what it can no longer afford to keep absorbing. For Queen Elizabeth II, that often meant silence, patience, and the careful belief that storms could be outlasted. For King Charles III, it has meant trying to balance the heart of a father with the discipline of a sovereign. But for William, the calculation seems different. He has grown into his role during an era when royal privacy can be broken in a single interview, a single book, a single streaming project, or a single sentence taken out of context and carried around the world. That changes the meaning of reconciliation. To an ordinary family, reconciliation might begin with a private conversation, a long apology, a painful but honest attempt to sit across a table and speak without cameras or advisors. But for the royal family, nothing stays ordinary for long. A private meeting can become a public symbol before the people involved have even agreed what it means. A father seeing his son can be read as a palace strategy. A brother sharing a room with another brother can be interpreted as forgiveness. A quiet visit can become a global argument about who has won, who has lost, and who has finally been accepted back into the fold. And this may be where William's reported position becomes so important. Some royal watchers believe the Prince of Wales is not simply rejecting emotion, but rejecting the machinery that often follows emotion. The speculation around Harry's possible plea is not powerful because people know every private detail. They do not. Buckingham Palace has not publicly confirmed the most dramatic claims being discussed. The power of the story comes from what it reveals about the atmosphere around the family, the sense that every attempt at peace now carries a shadow of risk. Was this a personal matter, or was the monarchy quietly protecting its future? That question becomes sharper when we consider the people who would be affected beyond the two brothers. King Charles would be placed once again in the most painful position a monarch can face, choosing how much fatherhood can be shown without weakening the authority of the crown. Queen Camilla would be drawn into the emotional weather of a family dispute she has spent years navigating carefully. Catherine would be watched for every expression, every silence, every absence. Even the Wales children, though still young, would one day inherit the public consequences of choices made now. That is the part often overlooked in louder discussions. Royal decisions do not disappear when the headline fades. They become part of the family's future architecture. They shape who is trusted, who is kept close, who is protected, and who is kept at a formal distance. If William is indeed becoming firmer about the boundaries around Harry, then this is not only a reaction to the past. It may be a rehearsal for the future monarchy, one built less around emotional repair and more around controlled access, clear hierarchy, and careful protection of the institution's public image. And that represents a very different royal language. For decades, the monarchy has often survived by allowing ambiguity. A vague statement could calm a storm. A carefully arranged appearance could suggest unity without needing to explain everything behind it. A family gathering could send the message that disagreements had softened, even when the truth was more complicated. But the Harry and William fracture has tested that old method. Ambiguity has not always healed the wound. Sometimes, it has made the speculation louder. So if the Prince of Wales is now choosing firmness, it may be because he believes uncertainty has become too expensive. That does not mean the decision would be painless. It does not mean it would be morally simple. It does not mean viewers should see one brother as entirely right and the other as entirely wrong. The deeper tragedy is that both positions can carry a kind of truth. Harry may feel that without a private opening, there is no way to rebuild what has been lost. William may feel that without evidence of trust, any opening only exposes the family to another round of damage. One side may be asking for humanity. The other may be asking for protection. And when humanity and protection collide inside a monarchy, the crown usually chooses protection. This is why the reported refusal, whether understood as a direct decision or as part of a wider palace mood, feels more serious than another family disagreement. It suggests that the emotional terms of the royal split may be changing. The question may no longer be, will Harry return? It may now be, return to what? A family gathering, a private conversation, a carefully managed public signal, or a royal structure that has already decided that closeness cannot be offered without conditions. That uncertainty creates a deeper tension. Because Harry's relationship with the monarchy has always been shaped by two competing realities. He was born inside the institution, shaped by its rituals, protected and restricted by its walls. Yet he also became one of its most visible critics, speaking publicly about pain that the palace traditionally would have kept private. For supporters, that was courage. For critics, it was betrayal. For the monarchy, it created a practical problem that emotion alone could not solve. How do you welcome someone back into a system after that person has publicly challenged the system itself? There's no easy answer to that. And William's position may be hardening because he understands that his future reign cannot be built on unresolved questions. A future king has to know where the boundaries are. He has to know who can be brought into the inner circle, who must remain outside it, and how much personal forgiveness can be separated from institutional trust. That is a colder way to look at family, but monarchy has always been colder than ordinary family life. It turns personal choices into public meaning. It turns silence into strategy. It turns distance into policy. Yet this is also where sympathy becomes complicated, because even if viewers believe William has reason to be cautious, it is difficult to ignore the human sadness of the situation. Two brothers who once walked behind their mother's coffin now stand on opposite sides of a royal future. One is preparing to carry the crown forward. The other is trying to define his place outside the structure that shaped him. Their disagreement is not only about past grievances. It is about identity, memory, loyalty, and whether love can survive after trust has been publicly broken. And that may be why audiences remain so invested. People are not only watching a royal dispute, they are watching a family question that many understand in their own lives, only magnified by titles, palaces, and history. When trust is damaged, who makes the first move? When apologies are not enough, what comes next? When one person wants a conversation and another believes the conversation itself may cause harm, is refusal an act of cruelty or an act of self-protection? Inside the royal world, those questions carry consequences far beyond emotion. If William's approach becomes the guiding principle, then future contact with Harry may be measured not by affection, but by reliability. It may depend less on what is hoped for, and more on what can be guaranteed. The monarchy may be prepared to show courtesy, even compassion, but not necessarily access. It may allow formal respect without offering private restoration. And for Harry, that distinction could be devastating, because being treated politely from a distance is not the same as being welcomed back into trust. But the most sensitive implication is not only about Harry. It is about the balance of power behind palace doors. If Charles still feels the pain of a father but William increasingly carries the logic of the future king, then the royal household may be entering a period where two instincts exist side by side. The king may wish to keep a line of communication open. The Prince of Wales may believe that every open line must now be guarded. One looks at the wound through the lens of parenthood, the other looks at it through the lens of succession. And once that possibility enters the story, the whole situation becomes more delicate, because a monarchy cannot publicly admit every internal tension. It cannot explain every private disagreement or reveal every difficult conversation. Instead, the public is left to read the signs: who appears together, who remains absent, who speaks warmly, who stays silent, and who seems to carry the final weight of the decision. Those signs may not tell the whole truth, but in royal life, they often tell enough. So the real question moving forward is not simply whether Harry's reported plea was refused. The deeper question is whether William is now setting the emotional rules for the next era of the royal family. Rules that may define not only how Harry is handled, but how the monarchy protects itself from future crises, future accusations, and future attempts to turn private pain into public negotiation. And if that is what is beginning to happen, then the next chapter becomes even more sensitive. Because behind the visible story of reconciliation, another issue is quietly emerging. Not only who is allowed back into the family, but who now has the authority to decide what the family must become. Because once authority begins to move quietly inside a royal household, it rarely announces itself with speeches. It appears in restraint, in timing, in who speaks less, and in who seems to carry the final responsibility when the family faces another difficult choice. And if royal observers are reading this moment correctly, the question is no longer only whether Prince Harry can be brought closer again. The question is whether Prince William has already begun shaping the boundaries of the monarchy he will one day inherit. That is what makes this reported refusal feel so different from earlier moments of distance. In the past, the royal split often appeared to move in cycles. A public wound would open. A period of silence would follow. Then speculation would begin again about whether a family occasion, a royal health concern, a funeral, a coronation, or a private message might soften the division. There was always some imagined bridge just ahead, some future event that might create the right atmosphere for a cautious return. But according to the way many commentators are interpreting this latest discussion, that old cycle may be losing its power. And that matters because the monarchy has always depended on controlled possibility. The palace does not need to reveal every decision to create an impression. Sometimes, simply leaving a question unanswered allows hope to survive. For years, the idea that reconciliation could still happen served a purpose. It softened the image of the family. It allowed supporters of both brothers to believe that time, grief, and maturity might eventually do what public statements could not. It gave King Charles room to appear open-hearted without being forced into a dramatic gesture. It gave Harry space to remain emotionally connected to the family story, even while living outside the working royal structure. But what happens when possibility itself becomes a problem? That is the deeper issue now taking shape. If the palace continues to allow every silence to be read as a potential opening, then every royal event becomes a test of Harry's status. Will he be invited? Will he attend? Will William speak to him? Will Catherine stand nearby? Will Charles make time? Will the seating arrangement mean something? Will one photograph suggest forgiveness? The monarchy then becomes trapped inside a drama it cannot fully control because the public begins looking for reconciliation in every gesture, even when the family may be trying to avoid sending any message at all. This is where William's reported firmness begins to look strategic rather than purely emotional. Some royal watchers believe the future king is trying to end the uncertainty before it keeps defining the monarchy from the outside. Not because the pain has disappeared, and not because the family bond means nothing, but because uncertainty has become its own public storyline. And for a future monarch, that is dangerous. A royal household cannot build stability if every major appearance is overshadowed by questions about one absent figure. It cannot keep allowing the same wound to return at every symbolic moment. At some point, the institution has to decide whether it is managing a temporary fracture or accepting a permanent reality. And if that acceptance is beginning now, it would explain why the tone around reconciliation feels colder than before. It would also explain why the situation affects more than Harry and William. For Charles, the continued possibility of reconciliation allows emotional room, but it also keeps reopening the same difficult question: how far can a father go without placing the crown in a weaker position? For Camilla, every renewed discussion risks pulling her back into old tensions and public judgments that the palace has worked carefully to move beyond. For Catherine, the danger is different. She can become a symbol without ever choosing to be one, and in royal life, symbols can be powerful but deeply unfair. That symbolic pressure may be one of the hidden forces behind William's approach. The Princess of Wales has built her public image around steadiness, discretion, family, and duty. She does not need to speak loudly to be understood by the public. That quiet authority is part of her strength, but it also means her presence can be used to say things she has not said. If she stands near Harry at the right moment, some may call it healing. If she remains distant, others may describe it as a refusal. If she protects her privacy, speculation fills the space. And William, more than anyone, understands how easily one public image can become a burden placed on someone who never asked to carry it. So when people ask why the Prince of Wales might resist even a carefully managed gesture, the answer may lie in that danger. A gesture can look gentle from the outside and still carry heavy consequences inside the family. It can ask one person to absorb pressure so another person can be offered dignity. It can make the monarchy appear united before trust has been rebuilt. And if that image later collapses, the public disappointment becomes sharper than before. William may be calculating that false hope is no longer kinder than honest distance. But there is another layer beneath this, and it is one that royal history understands very well. The monarchy has survived by separating personal feeling from institutional responsibility. Kings and queens have often been required to make decisions that would seem almost impossible in an ordinary family. Relationships become questions of state. Private loyalty becomes public strategy. Even forgiveness, when attached to royal status, has to be measured against the effect it may have on the institution. That does not make the people involved emotionless. It means their emotions are never allowed to remain private for long. And perhaps that is the part Harry may find most painful. Because from the outside, he may see a family that has become too formal, too guarded, too unwilling to meet him halfway. But from inside the palace structure, William may see something very different. He may see a pattern in which emotional appeals create public pressure forces royal responses, and royal responses then become material for further interpretation. If that is the pattern he believes has taken hold, then a simple meeting is no longer simple. It becomes the beginning of another cycle. Was this about personal loyalty, or was the institution quietly protecting itself from being pulled into that cycle again? The answer may be both, and that is why the story continues to hold such emotional force. William is not just a brother standing at a distance. He is a husband, a father, and a future monarch whose entire adult life has been shaped by the expectation that he must preserve the crown. Harry is not just a critic from outside. He is a son of the king, a brother of the heir, and a man whose identity remains inseparable from the royal world he left behind. Their positions are not clean opposites. They are two wounded versions of the same history. That shared history is what gives the present conflict its weight. The brothers were formed by the same childhood loss, the same palace corridors, the same public expectations, and the same impossible education in grief and duty. But their responses to that life moved in opposite directions. William leaned further into the institution, accepting that survival required discipline, silence, and sacrifice. Harry stepped away from it, arguing in his own way that silence had carried too high a price. One became the face of continuity, the other became the voice of rupture. And now, years later, reconciliation is difficult because it is not only about forgiving words or actions. It is about whether those two visions of royal life can ever sit in the same room without one threatening the other. That is why the palace's apparent direction feels like a turning point. If William's future monarchy is being shaped around a tighter circle, then trust becomes the central currency. Not popularity, not sentiment, not nostalgia. Trust, who can be relied upon to protect private conversations, who understands the difference between family pain and public performance, who can stand inside the institution without turning its internal struggles into outside pressure. These are not warm questions, but they are the questions that matter to a monarchy trying to survive in the modern media age. And for Harry, that creates a painful contradiction. He may want acknowledgement, understanding, and a way to be heard as a son and brother. But the very public nature of the past few years may have made the palace more cautious about offering exactly that. The more visible the rupture became, the harder it became to repair quietly. The more the world watched, the more any private step toward him would be interpreted as a royal concession. And the more a concession seemed possible, the more the palace risked losing control of the message. That is why the phrase, "no reconciliation left," even if used more by commentators than by official voices, carries such emotional force. It suggests not that love has vanished, but that the process may have collapsed. It suggests that whatever private feeling remains has been separated from royal access. A family can still feel sorrow. A father can still feel concern. A brother can still remember what once existed. But an institution can decide that memory is not enough to reopen the gate. And here, the balance of power becomes even more revealing. Charles may still represent the emotional center of the family conflict because he is the father whose younger son remains outside the working royal fold. But William represents the future consequences. That difference matters. A father may think in terms of regret, healing, and the pain of distance. A future king must think in terms of precedent, stability, and the message sent to everyone watching. If those instincts do not perfectly align, the palace may not need a visible disagreement for tension to exist. The tension would already be there, built into their different roles. This is where the story moves beyond one plea. Because if William's voice is becoming decisive on matters involving Harry, then the monarchy may be quietly acknowledging that the future cannot be managed by the emotions of the present. Charles can offer grace where he feels it is possible, but William will eventually inherit whatever consequences follow. Every softened line, every possible invitation, every private meeting that becomes public speculation would not only affect the king's reign. It would become part of the atmosphere surrounding William's. And the future king appears to know it. That awareness may explain the guarded tone, the reluctance to allow symbolic gestures, and the insistence that trust must come before any public impression of healing. It may also explain why the public is beginning to sense that a deeper transition is underway. Not a formal handover, not an abdication of authority, but a gradual emotional transfer, where the family begins to understand that William's judgment will define the next chapter, even while Charles still wears the crown. And once that possibility is accepted, the reported refusal takes on a different meaning. It becomes less like an isolated answer to Harry, and more like a signal of the monarchy's future operating system. Less ambiguity, less emotional improvisation, less willingness to let public pressure decide private access. More control, more boundaries, more emphasis on protecting the Wales family as the center of the next reign. That may comfort those who believe the crown needs firmness after years of turbulence. But it may trouble those who believe the monarchy risks appearing too cold if it closes every route back. And that contradiction is exactly where the next turn in the story begins. Because even if William's strategy is clear, strategy alone cannot erase the emotional cost. A firm boundary may protect the institution, but it also creates a human consequence that no palace language can fully soften. Harry's position becomes more uncertain. Charles's sorrow becomes more complicated. Catherine's symbolic role becomes more sensitive. And William's image as a future king begins to harden into something the public will either respect or question. But even that does not explain the most sensitive part of the story. Because the real question is no longer only whether William had the authority to draw the line. It is whether someone inside the royal world understood, before everyone else did, that drawing that line would change not just Harry's future, but the emotional identity of the monarchy itself. And that is where the pressure begins to rise, because the most consequential royal shifts are often recognized first by the people closest to the machinery of the institution, not always by the public. not always by commentators. Sometimes, the first people to understand that a family story has become a constitutional story are the advisors, aides, and senior figures who know how quickly emotion can turn into precedent. According to royal observers, this may be the moment when Harry's position inside the wider royal narrative began to change in a way that could not easily be reversed. Not because an official statement had necessarily declared anything final in dramatic language, and not because Buckingham Palace had publicly explained every private calculation, but because the atmosphere around the issue appeared to shift from uncertainty into containment. That is a quieter word than rejection, but in royal life, containment can be even more powerful. It means the story is no longer allowed to expand freely. It is managed, narrowed, and kept away from the center of the institution. And if that interpretation is correct, the consequences are far larger than one refused conversation. For Harry, the most painful consequence may not be distance itself, because distance has existed for years. The sharper consequence is the possibility that distance is becoming formalized, not necessarily through a public decree, but through the absence of movement. No visible warming, no carefully staged reunion, no obvious sign that the royal household is preparing a bridge for him to cross. In ordinary family life, silence can sometimes mean time is needed. In royal life, silence can become structure. That is what makes the stage of a story so serious, because once the monarchy begins to structure distance, every future moment changes meaning. A birthday message becomes a test. An invitation becomes a signal. A non-invitation becomes a headline. A royal event becomes a map of who belongs where. Even if the palace says very little, the public reads everything. And if William's reported approach is now guiding the boundaries, then Harry may find that his relationship with the family is no longer being shaped by emotional possibility, but by institutional caution. For Charles, that creates a deeply uncomfortable burden. The king has always had to carry two roles at once, but this particular conflict makes the division almost impossible to hide. As a father, Charles may naturally feel sorrow over the idea of a son remaining outside the closest family circle. As monarch, he has to understand why the institution cannot keep reopening wounds that may later be exposed, debated, or weaponized in the public arena. That does not mean the king feels no compassion. It means his compassion has to pass through the cold filter of duty, and that filter is exactly what William seems prepared to enforce. Some royal watchers believe the Prince of Wales is increasingly unwilling to allow emotional appeals to shape institutional outcomes. If accurate, that would mark a meaningful turning point. It would suggest that the future king is no longer simply reacting to the Sussex crisis as a brother wounded by the past, but responding as the person who must protect the monarchy's next chapter. That difference matters, because the moment William acts from the position of future authority, the family dispute becomes a rehearsal for his reign. But was this simply a reaction to Harry, or was it part of a wider institutional calculation? That question becomes more important when we look at the public image of the Wales family. William and Catherine have increasingly come to represent continuity, discipline, and the emotional center of the monarchy's next generation. Their image is built around steadiness. They do not need to be theatrical to be powerful. Their strength comes from reliability, from appearing calm when the wider royal story becomes unsettled. And because of that, any renewed public association with Harry would not be read as a casual family gesture. It would be read as a statement about the future. That is why Catherine's role remains so sensitive, even when she is not publicly speaking about the issue. Her presence beside William carries enormous symbolic weight. The palace understands it. The media understands it. The public understands it. A single image of Catherine standing warmly near Harry could travel across the world as proof that the old wound was closing. But if the reality behind that image remained fragile, the gesture could create a false expectation that the family would then be forced to live up to. In that sense, Catherine is not just affected by the story, she becomes one of the symbols the story tries to use. And William appears determined not to let that happen without trust behind it. This may be one of the strongest turning points in the entire situation. The reported refusal is not only about keeping Harry at a distance. It is about protecting the meaning of royal symbols from being used too early, too easily, or too emotionally. The monarchy knows that symbols can heal, but it also knows they can mislead. A handshake can look like forgiveness. A shared service can look like unity. A quiet family meeting can become a global narrative before anyone inside the room is ready to carry its meaning. That is the danger William may be trying to stop. Because if a reunion were to happen and then break down again, the damage would not only affect the brothers. It could weaken public confidence in the palace's ability to manage its own family crisis. It could make the monarchy appear reactive, sentimental, or vulnerable to pressure. It could suggest that the institution is still allowing unresolved personal conflict to dictate public rhythm. And for a future monarch whose entire image depends on discipline and stability, that risk may feel unacceptable. At the same time, there is a cost to firmness. A monarchy that protects itself too coldly can appear distant from ordinary human feeling. Viewers who sympathize with Harry may see William's reported position as unforgiving, a sign that the institution has chosen control over compassion. Others may see it as necessary leadership, the kind of difficult boundary that protects the king, Catherine, the children, and the future of the crown. That divided reaction is exactly why the story has such force. It does not offer the public a simple villain and a simple victim. It forces people to decide what matters more, family repair or institutional trust. And that debate is now moving from private tension into public meaning. The palace may not need to confirm every detail for the public mood to shift. Once people sense that reconciliation is no longer the expected direction, they begin to interpret the entire royal story differently. Harry's future appearances in Britain, his comments about family, his relationship with his father, and his place in major royal moments all begin to sit under a different question. Not, when will the family reunite? But, has the monarchy already moved on? That is a far more serious question. Because if the monarchy has moved on, even quietly, then Harry's role changes from estranged family member to permanent outside figure. He may still remain the king's son. He may still remain William's brother. Those personal truths cannot be erased. But royal relevance is not based only on blood. It is based on trust, proximity, duty, and the willingness of the institution to include someone in its visible future. If that willingness is weakening, then the emotional story and the institutional story are no longer moving together. For Harry, that separation would be deeply painful. For William, it may be unavoidable. This is where historical parallels begin to hover around the edges, even if no comparison is perfect. The royal family has faced difficult exits, fractured loyalties, and painful separations before. Each generation has had to decide whether the person outside the central circle should remain connected, be quietly managed, or be kept at a distance for the sake of stability. The details are always different, but the institutional instinct is often similar. The crown survives by reducing uncertainty, and Harry has become, fairly or unfairly, a source of uncertainty for the palace. Not merely because he left royal duties, but because the aftermath of that departure became so public, so emotional, and so difficult to contain. Reports, interviews, accusations, commentary, and counter-commentary created a climate where even a small gesture could carry enormous consequences. If William now believes that the only way to protect the monarchy is to stop feeding that uncertainty, then his refusal is not a moment of anger. It is a strategy of containment, but containment does not heal. It preserves. That distinction is crucial. The palace can preserve stability without resolving the wound. It can protect public image while leaving private sorrow untouched. It can maintain dignity while allowing emotional distance to harden. And that may be the quiet tragedy at the center of the story. The monarchy may be doing what it believes it must do to survive, but survival does not always look like reconciliation. Sometimes, survival looks like silence, formal distance, and a carefully guarded future. And this is why the public perception shift matters so much. If William is seen as the person who finally drew the line, his image may change. Supporters may view him as decisive, protective, and ready for the burdens of kingship. Critics may see him as rigid, too cautious, or unwilling to separate brotherhood from institution. Either way, the decision begins to define him. It presents him not only as the sympathetic son of Diana or the steady husband beside Catherine, but as a future monarch capable of making choices that hurt in private because they may protect the crown in public. That is a much more serious image of William than the public has sometimes been used to seeing. And for Charles, the shift may be equally significant. If the king allows William's harder line to stand, it suggests that the monarchy is beginning to orient itself around the future, even while the present reign continues. It does not mean Charles is powerless. It means the institution understands that William will inherit the consequences, and therefore his judgment cannot be treated as secondary. That quiet recognition may be one of the most important, unseen developments in the entire story. Because when the future king's boundary becomes the family's boundary, the next reign has already begun to cast its shadow. That shadow now falls across Harry, across Charles, across Catherine, and across the public understanding of what reconciliation even means. The story is no longer about whether two brothers might one day speak privately. It is about whether the monarchy can afford to let hope remain open when trust remains broken. It is about whether a family can still claim emotional connection while denying institutional access. It is about whether the crown's future will be shaped by forgiveness or by discipline. And yet, even after all of this, one final uncertainty remains. Because boundaries can protect the monarchy, but they can also reveal what the monarchy is becoming. If William's reported position is the beginning of a new royal era, then the consequences will not end with Harry. They will shape how the public understands loyalty, belonging, duty, and family inside the modern crown. And that is where the final part of this story becomes impossible to ignore, because the real consequence was not only what happened in this moment. It was what this moment revealed about the future. And what it may reveal is that the monarchy is no longer measuring this crisis only through the language of family pain. It is measuring it through the language of succession, stability, and public trust. That is why this reported moment feels larger than one strained relationship. If royal observers are right, this is the point where the institution begins to ask a colder question. Not whether reconciliation would be emotionally moving, but whether it would make the crown stronger or weaker. That is the difference between a private family hope and a royal future. For Harry, the human meaning remains painful. He may still wish to be understood, not as a problem to be managed, but as a son and brother whose history cannot be separated from the family he left. That desire, if reports are accurate, would not be difficult for many people to understand. Families do fracture. People do look back. Time does sometimes soften anger. But inside the royal world, time alone does not rebuild access. Trust has to be restored before symbolism can safely return, and that is where the gap appears almost impossible to close. Because the monarchy cannot afford gestures that mean one thing privately and another thing publicly. A quiet family exchange might be intended as a first step, but the world would not treat it gently. It would be studied, interpreted, and turned into proof that something had shifted. A single appearance could become 1,000 headlines. One respectful interaction could become a global announcement of peace, even if no true peace existed behind it. And that is why William's reported position, however painful, may reflect a future reign shaped by one guiding principle: the institution will not offer symbols before trust is secure enough to carry them. This is where the long-term consequence becomes clearer. The next phase of the monarchy may be less willing to live inside emotional ambiguity. It may become more disciplined, more protective, and more cautious about who is allowed close to the central image of the crown. That does not mean compassion disappears. It means compassion may no longer be allowed to dictate public strategy. Courtesy may remain. Family feeling may remain. But the visible structure of royal belonging could become far more guarded. And for Harry, that distinction matters deeply. Being loved privately, if that love still exists, is not the same as being restored publicly. Being acknowledged as the king's son is not the same as being trusted as part of the royal future. Being treated with dignity from a distance is not the same as being welcomed back into the circle where decisions, symbols, and family image are protected. That may be the hardest part of the story. The door people often imagine as either open or closed may, in royal terms, have become something more complicated, personally sorrowful, but institutionally sealed. For Charles, the meaning is equally heavy. His reign has already been marked by transition, health concerns, public scrutiny, and the challenge of holding together a monarchy after the long stability of Queen Elizabeth II. The Harry question has never been only political or symbolic for him. It is personal, but a king cannot live only inside personal feeling. Charles may feel the sadness of distance, but he must also understand that any step toward Harry would be judged not only as fatherly compassion, but as royal direction. That is the burden of wearing the crown. Even love becomes a public act. And William, standing one step away from that burden, seems to be learning the lesson in real time. The Prince of Wales may be judged by some as too firm, by others as responsible, but either interpretation points to the same larger truth. He is no longer being viewed simply as the elder brother in a painful family dispute. He is being watched as the man whose instincts may define the next reign. His handling of Harry, if this reported direction continues, may become one of the earliest signs of how he intends to protect the monarchy, not through endless explanation, but through boundaries, not through emotional performance, but through controlled distance, not through gestures designed to please the public in the moment, but through decisions meant to survive history. That is a serious shift. It suggests that the monarchy's future image may be built around a smaller, more disciplined center. William, Catherine, and their children represent continuity, and the palace will likely be careful about anything that threatens that image. The royal household may still respect family ties, but it may not allow those ties to interrupt the story of stability it is trying to tell. That is where the emotional and institutional meanings separate. The family may remain wounded, but the monarchy must keep moving. And perhaps that is the final tragedy. No one truly wins when brotherhood becomes a matter of strategy. Harry does not win if he remains outside the trust of the family he was born into. William does not win if protecting the crown requires permanent distance from his brother. Charles does not win if the peace of his reign depends on accepting a wound he cannot fully heal. Catherine does not win if her dignity continues to be used as a symbol in a story she has not chosen to tell. The monarchy may survive the crisis, but survival is not the same as restoration. Still, survival has always been the monarchy's deepest instinct. It has endured scandals, abdications, divorces, grief, public anger, and generational change by adapting when it had to and closing ranks when it felt threatened. What may be happening now, according to some royal commentators, is another form of adaptation. The institution may be deciding that the Sussex chapter can no longer remain an open question at the center of royal life. It may be moving Harry from unresolved possibility into managed distance, from emotional uncertainty into formal caution, from a future question into a settled boundary. If that is true, then this story was never just about whether William overruled a plea. It was about whether the monarchy has reached the end of believing that reconciliation can be safely used as a public hope. It was about whether trust, once broken in such a visible way, can ever be rebuilt without first proving that private pain will remain private. And it was about whether the future king is prepared to make choices that may look cold in the present because he believes they will protect the crown in the years ahead. So the central question remains, was this simply one difficult royal development, or does it point to a much larger shift inside the monarchy? Is William protecting his family from another painful cycle, or is the institution becoming too guarded to allow healing? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep royal analysis, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next documentary-style royal story. Because in the end, the most powerful royal decisions are not always the ones announced loudly. Sometimes, they are the quiet boundaries that reveal what the future monarchy is willing to become.